Hello, class. Welcome to chapter 23 of the Gospel of Matthew. Let's look at verse number 1. Then Jesus spoke to the crowds and to his disciples, saying, The scribes and the Pharisees have seated themselves in the chair of Moses. Therefore, all that they tell you, do and observe. But do not do according to their deeds, for they say things and do not do them. They tie up heavy burdens and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are unwilling to move them with so much as a finger. Now let's look at the commentary. The hypocrisy and unbelief of Israel's religious leaders, evidenced in the previous chapter 22, prompted a strong message from Jesus. He turned to the crowds and disciples who had heard the debates. Jesus warned them about the teachings of the scribes and the Pharisees, saying their authority was to be recognized, that is, they sit in Moses' seat and they teach the law, but their practices were hypocritical and should not be followed. They placed heavy burdens upon heavy burdens on the people, but were not righteous themselves. All their works were performed to be observed by men. Let's read verse number 5. But Jesus continues. He says, But they do all their deeds to be noticed by men, for they broaden their phylacteries and lengthen the tassels of their garments. They love the place of honor at banquets and the chief seats in the synagogues and respectful greetings in the marketplaces and being called rabbi by men. But do not be called rabbi, for one is your teacher, and you are all brothers. Look at the commentary. The phylacteries were small leather pouches containing strips of parchment with Old Testament verses, were tied to the left arms and to the foreheads of the scribes and Pharisees. They were wide and very conspicuous for everybody to see. And the tassels of their prayer shawls were long and noticeable as well. They loved places of honor and to be called rabbi, implying they were scholars. Such was not to be the attitude of Jesus' followers. Titles such as rabbi, father, teacher, and position were not to be sought. Instead, there should be a brotherly relationship among the disciples. Let's read verse 9. Jesus continues, Do not call anyone on earth your father, for one is your Father, he who is in heaven. Do not be called leaders, for one is your leader, that is Christ. But the greatest among you shall be your servant. Whoever exalts himself shall be humbled, and whoever humbles himself shall be exalted. Jesus was not saying there would be no lines of authority among them, but he was emphasizing that service for him was more important than human positions of honor. Leadership positions should never be a goal in and of themselves, but should always be viewed as opportunities to serve others. The Pharisees who exalted themselves would be humbled, and Jesus' followers, by humbling themselves in service, would someday be exalted. Jesus continues in verse 13. He says, he's talking to the scribes and Pharisees, But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. Then he calls them hypocrites, because you shut off the kingdom of heaven from people. For you do not enter in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering in to go in. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you devour widows' houses, and for a pretense you make long prayers. Therefore you will receive greater condemnation. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you travel around on sea and land to make one proselyte, and when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves. Now look at the commentary. Jesus warns the scribes and Pharisees of ultimate destruction if they continued in the current path. Thus Matthew indicates Jesus pronounced 8 woes on them. The first woe, they were preventing others from entering the kingdom that John the Baptist Jesus and the 12 disciples were proclaiming. The scribes and Pharisees' failure to accept Jesus as Messiah King had placed a stumbling block in the paths of their countrymen. Then we see, look at the second woe. The scribes and Pharisees inconsistently made long prayers to impress people with their spirituality, but also impress widows whom they should have helped. The third woe. They actively traveled not only over land and sea to make even one convert, but by imposing the restriction of rabbinic tradition, they were preventing them from seeing the truth. As a result, the convert became more Pharisaic than the Pharisees themselves. Jesus continues in verse 16. He says, "Woe to you, blind guides who say, whoever swears by the temple, that is nothing, but whoever swears by the gold of the temple is obligated. You fools and blind men, which is more important, the gold or the temples that sacrifice the gold? And whoever swears by the altar, that is nothing, but whoever swears by the offering on it, he is obligated. You blind men, which is more important, the offering or the altar that sacrifices the offering? Therefore, whoever swears by the altar swears both by the altar and by everything on it. And whoever swears by the temple swears both by the temple and by him who dwells within it. And whoever swears by heaven swears both by the throne of God and by him who sits upon the throne." Now we look at the commentary and the fourth woe. When taking oaths, the scribes and Pharisees made fine lines of distinction so that they could possibly invalidate their oath. They were wrong in suggesting that gold was greater than the temple and a gift greater than the altar. Jesus said any oath based on the temple was binding, for behind it was the one who dwelt in it. This was parallel to making an oath by God's throne, for that oath was also binding because of the one who sat on the throne. Now, and Jesus continues in verse 23, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier provisions of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. But these are the things you should have done without neglecting the others. You blind guides, who strain out a gnat and swallow a camel." Now we look at the commentary and the fifth woe. The scribes and Pharisees meticulously tithed all their possessions. They even went so far as to carry the practice down to the smallest spices from plants. While meticulously following the law in this area, they failed to manifest the justice, mercy, and faithfulness demanded by the law. They were majoring on minors, straining out a gnat, while minoring on majors, swallowing a camel. Being so busy with small details, they never dealt with the important matters. Jesus was saying the scribes and Pharisees were completely neglecting one area at the expense of the other. They should have been doing both. Since they were not, they were blind guides. Jesus continues in verse 25. "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you clean the outside of the cup and of the dish, but inside they are full of robbery and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and of the dish, so that the outside of it may become clean also. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside appear beautiful, but inside they are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. So you too outwardly appear righteous to men, but inwardly you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness." Now look at the commentary and the sixth woe. The scribes and Pharisees were concerned with external cleanliness, such as the outside of the cup and dish, but in their hearts was greed and self-indulgence. Their cleanliness was primarily for the sake of being seen by men. But they were not above robbery and excesses in their own lives. If cleansing could take place internally, their outside would also be affected. Then we look at the seventh woe. While the sixth woe stressed the actions of the scribes and Pharisees, the seventh stressed their appearances. Jesus called them whitewashed tombs. At that time, tombs were painted white on the outside to appear beautiful, but inside was the decaying flesh of the dead. Similarly, the scribes and Pharisees appear outwardly as righteous, but inside they were full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Jesus continues in verse 29. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! He keeps calling them hypocrites, which they were. For you build the tombs of the prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous, and say, if we had been living in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partners with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. So you testify against yourselves then, that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up, then, the measure of the guilt of your fathers. You serpents, you brood of vipers, how will you escape the sentence of hell? Looking at the commentary, we see the eighth woe. The scribes and Pharisees spent time building tombs and decorating the graves of the righteous. They were quick to say that if they had lived at the time of the prophets, they would never have been involved in shedding blood and of these righteous men. Jesus knew they were already plotting his death. By that act, the scribes and Pharisees would demonstrate they were just like the former generations who murdered the prophets. By rejecting the prophet, they would be following in the footsteps of their forefathers and filling up their ancestors' sin. They were rejecting Jesus. In severe language, Jesus condemned the scribes and Pharisees, calling them snakes and brood of vipers whose eternal destiny was hell, that is the Greek word Gehenna, the place of eternal punishment. Jesus continues in verse 34. Therefore, behold, Jesus said, I am sending you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, so that upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly, I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. Look at the commentary. Jesus promised to send them prophets and wise men and teachers, but the religious leaders would reject their words and even kill some and flog and pursue others. The response of the religious leaders to the proclaimed truth would justify the judgment coming on them as a nation. Abel was the first righteous martyr mentioned in the Old Testament, and Zechariah was the last martyr. On that generation of Jews in Jesus' day would fall God's judgment for their involvement in shedding innocent blood. Jesus was anticipating Israel's continuing rejection of the good news of their Messiah. Their rejection of Jesus as their Messiah ultimately led to the destruction of the temple in AD 70. And Jesus concludes here, look at verse 37, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together, the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were unwilling. Behold, your house is being left to you desolate. For I say to you, from now on you will not see me until you say, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Now look at the commentary. In a final lament over the city of Jerusalem, Jesus stated his desire for Israel. Jerusalem, the capital, represented the entire nation of Israel. People in Jerusalem had killed the prophets and stoned those God sent to them. Jesus longed to gather the nation together much as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings. The nation, unlike chicks that naturally run to their mother hen in times of danger, willfully refused to turn to the Lord. They were responsible to make a choice, and their choice brought condemnation. The result was their house was left desolate or alone. But Jesus is not through with the nation of Israel. Though he would soon depart at a future time, he will be accepted, not rejected. And that day the nation will say, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." A quotation from Psalms 118, verse 26. Jesus was speaking of his return to earth to establish his messianic kingdom. And that concludes this recording over Matthew chapter 23.